Welcome to What's So Sustainability Podcast Episode 6, which will be our final episode, produced in collaboration with Singapore Polytechnic School of Business and Sustainable Finance Institute Asia. I am your host, V.
And I'm Stephanie, Collaborations and Coalition Senior Associate from Sustainable Finance Institute Asia. A quick recap of what we have talked about over the past few episodes. We went from introductions to sustainable finance to getting industry experts from various fields, such as accounting firms, fintech, as well as an asset management company, to share more from their organization's perspectives. It has been a very meaningful and humbling experience for me at least, to learn from our guest speakers. And now we're down to our final episode to wrap things up, Careers in Sustainable Finance.
Yes, I agree with you. The past episode has been very knowledge enriching. We are also closing this series on a high as we are honored to have Kavitha Menon, Director of Singapore Sustainable Finance Association, here with us today.
Thank you for having me here.
We would like to get to know more about you and your background. Could you introduce yourself, your education, as well as your career background?
Sure, thanks, Stephanie. So I'm Kavitha Menon. I head Singapore Sustainable Finance Association. We are a newly established cross-sectoral industry body set up by Monetary Authority of Singapore, along with the financial sector to support the ecosystem for sustainable finance here. By training, I'm an engineer, but an engineer who realized quite early on in life that my heart was not truly in it, and so decided to pivot to a career in finance. As long as I remember, my dad was a banker, and so all our dinner table conversations used to be about banks, and I particularly love that interplay between finance and economics. So I went on to do an MBA with a major in finance. I did my CFA alongside. I spent 12 years in the investment industry, starting with the sell side and then moving to the buy side when I moved here to Singapore. So basically saw a growth from a junior analyst covering global financials to heading the research team for a global equity fund here. For me, the foray into ESG and sustainability basically started back in 2018, 2019. Now thinking about it, I don't know if it was midlife crisis, pre or post-COVID blues, or whatever you call it. I decided to kind of look back upon what was the impact that I had achieved through my work. It was also the time it coincided with me becoming a mother as well. And I started to unpack the impact side of my work. And as a trained financial analyst, my framework was always risk return, but impact seemed something that I couldn't really, bring it in to the spectrum of my understanding. I decided to take a year's break. I went back to school, did a master's in public administration with a focus on sustainable finance, and particularly at that intersection of sustainability, finance, and policy. I found my way back to Singapore last June, right around the time when they announced the setup of Singapore Sustainable Finance Association, and yeah, here we are today.
Thank you so much, Kavitha. So maybe to give some context as well, SSFA was established earlier this year to collaborate across the financial and real economy sector to support the growth of Singapore as a trusted, vibrant and inclusive sustainable finance center. The SSFA builds on the successful work of the Green Finance Industry Task Force, or GFIT, an industry group that the Monetary Authority of Singapore (MAS) established in 2019 to drive sustainable finance initiatives, facilitate collaboration, act as a convener for the ecosystem to work across various pillars, and enhance the exchange and learning of best practices from different sectors. So for a start, could I invite you to provide an overview of what the role SSFA plays in promoting sustainable finance in Singapore, as well as some current key initiatives and programs?
Absolutely, Stephanie. So you kind of got the gist there in terms of what we are set up to do. And we are a continuation of the efforts which started with the Green Finance Industry Task Force. But when the decision was taken to set up a permanent industry body, I think we decided that we needed three distinguishing features for SSFA. First was the focus was on building a convening platform for sustainable finance in Singapore. And that means building on existing industry initiatives on sustainable finance. Not trying to reinvent the wheel here, but connecting the dots on what's already working. Second is membership really need to go beyond convening just the financial sector. We needed to bring in the real economy where the actual impact and decarbonization needs to happen. Third is collaboration needs to go beyond Singapore's borders itself to kind of drive that regional and global alignment in terms of whether it's products, standards, frameworks or policies. So these ambitions were then crystallized into what we see today as SSFA's objectives, which is first to galvanize a sustainable finance ecosystem, Second, to facilitate collaboration between the real economy and the financial sector. Third, to foster international collaboration. And finally, to deepen the industry's sustainable finance capabilities. So today, we have opened a membership structure which is basically open to all organizations that have an active interest in advancing sustainable finance in Singapore. As of today, we have close to 80 members as part of SSFA. And one of the important priorities for 2024 was kicking off work streams in 5 key topics. These are carbon markets, transition finance, blended finance, natural capital and biodiversity, as well as taxonomy. These 5 areas were strategically chosen to enhance Singapore's competitiveness and support Singapore's ambition to be the regional as well as global sustainable finance hub. Today, we have close to 130 workstream members who are supporting these initiatives of SSFA by participating in these workstreams. And the fact that we have gathered so much interest shows and indicates the industry's willingness to basically come together to address some of these key challenges.
Sounds like there's a lot happening in this space. This is why SSFA needs someone experienced and talented like you to lead the association. Let's jump back to the portion on your career journey into sustainable finance. Could you share what attracted you to join the field of sustainable finance in the first place? How was your career journey led you to your current role as director to SSFA?
Yeah, I think it wasn't one particular moment which kind of led me to it. So the first sort of interaction at that with that side would be through the sector that I covered, like I said, global financials, which meant that financial inclusion, microfinance businesses, kind of dealing with that bottom of the pyramid was a part of my life for the last 15 years. But in 2020, 2021 in Singapore, as working as part of a global equity investment fund here, we started getting a lot of questions from clients, especially from Europe, which was ahead of Asia in terms of adoption of sustainable finance, as to how the equity fund was looking at integrating ESG. And that sort of got me into the process of looking at ESG in the context of investing, and how as a fund we could sort of integrate these factors and what will be the implication this has on the fund's investment methodology as well as process. When I kind of drove that exercise, I realized that there was a bit of a mindset shift and a bit of a change in perspective that I myself needed to, undergo. And being part of that ecosystem for such a long time, I almost wanted to take a pause, almost going over to the balcony. That's a concept that I learned back in school in a very interesting leadership course that I would love to talk more about. But I wanted to take myself out there and kind of look at sustainable finance from an outside-in perspective. So I basically chose a 1-year program in Boston and left Singapore, with my 3-year-old, to basically do this for 1 year, right? And I was in the minority there. There were not many people from the financial sector as a part of this cohort. We had over 200 students from 65 countries. I was in the midst of bureaucrats, activists, politicians, journalists, and kind of looking at the same impact investing and sustainable finance from multiple perspectives and kind of understanding the importance of collaboration. And that sort of now is very critical to the role that I do at SSFA.
I understand that you have come in contact with a lot of members from your different networks in school and even your career within the sustainable finance ecosystem. So maybe from your experience, what key skills and qualifications do you believe are an added advantage for someone who's interested to pursue a career in sustainable finance?
So I kind of look at it in 2 ways, right? I mean, if you're thinking about transitioning to here, either you are, especially in sustainable finance, you are a finance professional who understands the fundamentals of banking and investing and the economics of it, and now looking to incorporate or integrate sustainability within that. Or you are a true blue environmental champion, social champion, who's now understanding that this needs to be mainstreamed, and so we should be able to engage and communicate effectively with stakeholders from the finance community. So you kind of bridge and meeting in between. So I would look at hard skills being fundamental knowledge about finance, economics, sustainability, environment. You could even communication. You could come at it from different angles and perspectives here. But what I think is not emphasized enough is the soft skills part of it. And here, none of these changes, sort of tectonic, shifts that we are trying to drive is not happening without, the stakeholders, multiple stakeholders coming together. And so learning how to work and engage and understand, where they're coming from, their priorities, is very, very important part of the role. Second is, nothing is concrete. So how do you deal with uncertainty, ambiguity? Frameworks are changing, standards are evolving. There's no, complete foolproof method for you to say that, okay, this is how you get started and this is the end result. You're kind of actually, I always like to say, you're kind of building the ship as you're sailing. So how do you deal with that? Now, is that something that's taught? Or that's something that, you develop? And the last is, I think that fluidity to kind of go between almost like quantitative or numerical information as well as that qualitative side of it. Because again, when you see finance, you think it's very analytical, it's very numerical. But then a lot of skill sets is required to navigate the space, actually requires you to be able to bring in that qualitative understanding of of situations. So yeah, these would be some of the things that I would highlight.
Understand. So as you have mentioned, these interdisciplinary skills, communication skills, and knowledge are definitely beneficial. How are there any non-finance skills that you find that are important and maybe valuable in this field as well?
For me, this whole understanding about it kind of began when I was back in school, like I said, in 2022, 23. And one of the important courses that I did there was on leadership. And this is by this professor at Harvard Kennedy School called Ronald Heifetz, who talks about how people need to understand when it's a technical challenge or a problem and when it's an adaptive problem. And I think what we're dealing with here in sustainability and in sustainable finance as such, it's an adaptive one because it's a massive change management exercise. You're trying to change the way people have done things for a really long time and have been very successful at it. For instance, think about my role as as head of research, in my last fund. I'm trying to tell portfolio managers who have created alpha, who've been extremely successful, that, now we need to change that investment process in terms of the framework of how do you explicitly bring in this environmental, social, and governance factors into, a financial investment analysis. It's not an easy exercise. It's not an easy proposition. So that really means that soft part of it, which you just emphasized, the communication skills, the interdisciplinary part of it, and knowing that this is not about process and procedures. It goes beyond that. It's you're asking people to change their deeply held beliefs, values, perspectives, and that's not an easy task.
Sustainable finance only took off within the last 5 years and is still evolving at a very rapid pace. How has the demand for professionals in sustainable finance evolved in Singapore over the past few years?
I think the way we have sort of moved into sustainable finance kind of explains the journey pretty well. If you look at the language that we use, say 5 years back, it started with green finance. It wasn't really sustainable finance, and also started pretty much with the environment part of it. So it was about financing green. So how do you finance wind? How do you finance solar projects? So renewables. And that was a very, I'm not saying easy, but that was easy to get everybody in because the impact was sort of out there for everyone to see. But an important part of the work, which has now started over the last few years, is actually greening the finance. So the existing system, how do you kind of ensure now, you're bringing in multiple sort of perspectives, and drivers into that conversation. And that shift has started to happen over the last 2-3 years. And I think there will be multiple sort of drivers, underlying drivers that's, sort of led to it, whether in 2019, Singapore kind of announcing a carbon tax and that sort of a signaling mechanism for the ecosystem that this is important. The work of the Green Finance Industry Task Force itself, to kind of develop that Singapore Asia taxonomy and some of the other work that the working group did was pretty critical in bringing a host of industry participants who looked at this area and bringing them all together in a very collaborative manner. I would say an important piece of research here that I should flag is the jobs transformation map, which is jointly commissioned by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, as well as the Institute of Banking and Finance and Workforce Singapore. And it basically maps out, how these skills, need to evolve over time, and how, sustainability is becoming mainstream in what was essentially considered a finance domain or finance specific job. And so as per their research, which was actually conducted by KPMG, 56% of job roles will be highly or moderately augmented with new sustainable finance related job tasks. And this is within the next 3 years. So this is financing the green that we are talking about. I mean, in fact, it should be greening the finance that we're talking about. And so it's basically that upskilling and capacity development which is required to support this shift and this transition.
As a student, are internships and hands-on experience important for those who are aspiring to work in this space? And for current professionals, who would you suggest for them to take on further studies? Any recommendations from your end?
So I don't think there's one set framework which works for everyone. But I always find that as much as possible, internships to start with, because when you test out some of the things that you've learned in theory and putting into practice, it's a whole different game. So I know how seriously, the teams that's building sustainable finance teams here in Singapore thinks about internships and how much time and effort is put into to kind of ensure that they get a complete lens of this landscape. I think that's a very, very important channel through which you sense check what you're learning. And you also understand your own interests, right? You're not trying to fit into the mold of what's already there. You're trying to see what fits for you and where you want to kind of navigate into, right? So from that, absolutely. The studies part of it, there are multiple ways you can do it. I mean, there are certifications available. There are part-time opportunities to kind of continuously upgrade. I don't think here there is an endpoint. Okay, I'm done studying and I'm kind of now in the field. I mean, I know all the senior stakeholders who are in the sustainable finance today, they study, they read more than any other people in the ecosystem. And so it's a continuous sort of process, but always good to start with knowing the technical skills before kind of getting into a role which demands you to actually utilize it.
Before we close off, we would like you to tell us what SSFA plans are for the future and how do you see SSFA evolving and adapting to the ever-changing sustainable finance landscape?
So we are a startup. We are 7 months old, but with very big ambitions, I must say. We've built up a solid team over the last 7 months, and the ambition is to really be that convening platform for sustainable finance, where we can actually bring the public as well as the private sector together, the NGOs as well as the academia together, and to drive innovative solutions and mobilize capital for sustainable finance. So that's the broad-based ambition. But the 5 work streams that I refer to, each of them have clear sort of targets that they are working towards. These are all very, very important areas where we are, looking to build frameworks, models, and best practices and guidances for the ecosystem. And another area would really be the capacity building. We are just getting started, and so it's a long runway. And in the process, we want to identify key collaborators and partners who want to support us and join us on this journey.
Understand, and this is actually what we're doing right now. It's also part of the capacity building for institutes of higher learning. So maybe any last words of advice would you like to give to our students and our listeners, and maybe young professionals like myself who are looking to pursue a career or further our careers in this space?
I think first thing I would say is don't jump into anything because it's the latest sort of fad. Whether it's AI or sustainability or sustainable finance, it's very difficult to make it stick. Rather, look at yourself, and I don't think anybody understands you better than yourself, and so kind of what do you enjoy, and which part of your personality traits and your own skills are transferable to this universe, and that sort of should be your guiding light rather than the other way around, trying to change yourself to fit into a mold. Second is, I think an opportunity that students and young professionals should use more is to network intentionally. It's not about spamming, but done a bit of a background work on the stakeholder that you're engaging with, and be quite shameless about it. Your hit rate might not be very successful in the beginning, but as people see that there is genuine interest there'll be a lot of like stakeholders to help. And like, I mean, I spent, I think, like 4 months in Singapore last year just meeting people for coffee. It would be 4 or 5 coffee chats every day, knowing stakeholders from different parts of the sustainable finance ecosystem and understanding what their challenges were and what they enjoyed about their role. And it helped me to take an informed decision when it was time. And this is talking about someone who's coming after 15 years of work experience. So there's no sort of like, entry point here. Do send out that LinkedIn emails. Do send out like, the request for coffee chats. People love to help, but it's just that you need to put in a bit of effort to understand what exactly you're trying to do here. And so it's not like an anonymous kind of like, emails going out to 50 other people. So put in the effort and network intentionally.
I see. And with that, thank you very much, Kavitha, for sharing your little nuggets of wisdom and advice. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for co-hosting and sharing as well. We have come to an end of the episode and end of What's So Sustainability series, produced in collaboration with Sustainable Finance Institute Asia and Singapore Polytechnic. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope that these conversations have enriched your understanding of sustainable finance space. And until next time, remember to invest in a sustainable tomorrow today.